Hello, my name is Daniel Ball. I am in Miss Madeline Craft's digital archaeology class, History 3161, and this is going to be my presentation about the stave churches of Norway. That said, this is to be uploaded to YouTube and submitted. Anyone else who sees this, well, whatever. Anyways, without any further ado, Norway. Land of fjords, food, snow, mountains, and immense natural beauty. Some mental images point to a history of raids, warriors from the north, marauders, and stories of paganism come to mind also. But what of churches and theology? In the modern day, Christian churches dot all of Norway, touting around 64% of the country as being Christian denomination. And by that extension, Christianity is no new concept to this country. Norway has a long history of Christianity within its borders. Centuries ago, they were viewed as little more than northern barbarians, and there is some truth to this, although not fair by any means, as I'll get to later. Scandinavian countries plundered a large portion of Europe in seasonal cycles, actually, due to the unique way that their infrastructure worked, with very little to be accomplished during the winter time, due to how bitter the land was and how rough the seasonal cycles were. So they would travel across the channel and they would raid. They'd steal gold, food, treasures of all kinds, and made slaves of Christian men and women. And while this would partially spread the nature of Christianity to them, this would not be any incumbent by any ways. These slaves came from all over Europe, however, from Germany, France, Poland, other old states, and they would all end up in Norway. Later wars would expedite the Christianization that we see today, but not necessarily the focal point of this. What we are focusing on is the way that Christianity presented itself in Norway's regions, specifically in the method of stave churches. Now, stave churches are, in their own right, very practical makes for a practical people. And what does that mean? What does practical mean? Practical in the sense that they are made to be renewable, they are meant to be as inexpensive as possible, and they are meant to still be functional, first and foremost. As even in Christianity's basis, a church is anywhere that people can gather, really. Anywhere that people of a congregation can gather. Hence the name congregate. Well, the ones in Norway are very much more simplistic than a lot of ones that you'd see in most of Europe. You can think of many of the old basilicas found in the remains of Rome, things like that. But much more of it is seen in a cultural symbol of simplicity. Norway is a very rugged terrain, with very scant resources, and really nothing to be wasted. And that makes their creation of these churches, especially in the way that they are now, very heartfelt. Stave churches, as we understand today, make up a large part of their representation of Christianity historically, and despite the more modern glorifications, they're mostly sticking to that practical design. Massive pine logs are raised after being split and rammed into the ground, and in many cases, typically 4 main support beams are all that really make up the structure. Now, that said, we have siding and defensive walls because, again, this is still a building. This is meant to be sheltered. This is meant to be a place people can come in to get out of the elements. So, for that, there's an issue to be had with the way that they're built. They have a strong stone foundation. Most buildings do. But they weren't able to be built on very flat ground, due to how hilly many parts of Norway are. So they'd often be set on flat stones of about the same height, specifically because of wood rot. Wood placed in the ground has a tendency to rot and decay over time, causing the structure of something to grow unstable. That said, if placed atop stones beneath the earth, it allows them to maintain some of their rigidity longer. And because of that, these stave churches are more incorporated into the landscape. These churches often weren't very ornate. They were very simplistic in most common things, only growing their ornate nature later. They'd have a place typically for a priest or the caretaker of the church to stay, and they'd have a communal room for men and women to gather within to listen to preaching. This would, of course, change as Christianity grew in the region, but I digress. They have a very palisade style, palisade being a defensive type of architecture seen as early as ancient Greece, and common and simple enough that several different people throughout history have picked this up. And this is a return to their practical nature with a lot of their work. Now, again, this is all well and good, but this again begs the question, why is this important in any way? Understanding stave churches and the way that they're presented in Norwegian history, we have the way that we see Christianity itself and the effects it had on their people. No evidence outside of documents actually shows any of the churches that existed before the 11th century. Christianity had actually reached the locale of Norway and Scandinavia itself in, I believe it was around the 6th century, or maybe 7th century. Point is, it had already been there for 200-300 years by the time any modern churches exist. And because of that, you compare it to churches like things in like Italy or in France. Things that have been around even longer and are much more ornate. But these are comparative. By understanding how Christianity manifested and the materials spared on even the most basic of churches, shows the early dedication that was felt by these Norwegian peoples and those of practicing faith. With more modern reconstructions, we can hopefully gather some evidence to the depths that were reached in the facilitation of these works as practical applications for a theological concept. Now, due to the much smaller nature of stave churches in early Christianity, the earliest churches we have archaeological evidence of are categorized in a few different ways. First, as A and B types. Now, what do I mean by that? A types are the sort of proto-frame for the churches that still exist today. They were coming from a different type of church, ones that were mainly set into the ground, that, due to the way that were set up, were incredibly bare bones. The first was simply called single naves, a nave being the main archway that you see on a church, the main roof, a single nave. The second were called, or that was roughly their translation. The second is called landkirkes, or long churches. And finally, mid-mast kirkes, or center-post churches. Single naves are the oldest seen, being dated back around 12th century Norway, and as previously described, are effectively a box with one main room and a separate room, with the landkirkes being similarly built, if in a more boxy rectangular way than just a squat room. Typically made this way for more comfort, taking up effective space, or allowing more people to congregate. The last that was developed in this proto-style was the mid-mast kirkes, or center-post churches. Now, single naves are very different than mid-masts. They're more of a look into resource management and practicality. Defying other creations, it's built entirely around a group of 3 to 4 center posts, or sometimes, if a big enough log was found, 1. They would have a layered hipped roof with bracing on the various exterior so as to provide for a more compact, tall design. Now, that said, we arrive at Type B. Now, Type B is where things get rather interesting for the sake of archaeological study. These come from a time when people had more expenses and time without consequences that they could spare the resources. That's not to say that they could just spend money and treasures willy-nilly, but you know what I mean. They're meant to be very lavish in their own way. The main two groups were named after two famous churches, Kaupanger and Borgund. Now, Kaupanger are most similar to the Southern European basilicas of traditional make, with rows of support beams and smaller, more decorative intermediate beams, mimicking stone capitalization styles. It's named for the Kaupanger Church, built around 1140 AD in modern-day Sogndal, and it's still in use today, actually, sitting around 125 people, according to the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Norwegian Monuments. The other primary design is in Borgund churches, which comes from the Vestland region of Norway, where construction is almost entirely comprised of vertical beams, with similar to other basilica floor plans. Now, Borgund itself is the home of the last freestanding bell tower church in Norway, a previous style that has quite literally fallen by the wayside due to structural issues. I won't spend too much time on them until later, but they all typically fell into palisade in their compounds, and their history has some interesting quirks when paired with Christianity. Along with transporting their religion, the Christianization of Scandinavia can be traced to around the 9th century through Ibo of Reims and Ansgar of Hamburg, who came to the region and converted various Danish peoples, ultimately leading them to their society becoming more literate actually due to exposure to Christianity, as previous Norwegian culture was very runic and orally spoken history. Also owed credit is one Hakon, excuse me while I check my note on this, Augustin Fostri, and his various descendants, who both went by Olafarsson, who subdued various communities with Christianity as a harness for social control. So, not all is quite so positive. Now, in more recent years, a critical problem that has come up with the study of stave churches are that of the decay of history. Literal ones, at that. As rugged as Norway is, and as rugged as the stave churches are, they're still fallible creations. Eternity has a certain affection for creations of time, and as the saying goes, nothing lasts forever, no matter how big a cultural symbol. And because of the way that ancient manuscripts are lost to fire, water, rain, we only have various schematics of how these were generated. At least in living examples, only around 30 of these stave churches exist today, which historically has been credited to almost 2,000 to 3,000 of these. So to say that they're less than 1% at this point is quite literal. Now, excuse me. While subjective, I'm of the opinion that the research done into the history of these stave churches that was conducted by the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Norwegian Monuments in 2021 is the most excellent out there. The society, which was formed in the mid-1800s by J.C. Dahl and Joachim Fritzsch, does, as their name implies, protecting various different portions of Norwegian culture, owning 40 different sites across Norway under close protection to them, which they legally own the names to. Along with them, the reconstruction effort was funded by the Trust of Norway. They surveyed 28 different churches around Norway at this time. Now, the claimed goal of the project was building research for the oldest European wooden churches and to go through digital acquisition and scientific investigation of the make of stave churches. This work was conducted by a group of team graduates led by Dr. Andrij Kutny from the Technical University of Munich. And they devoted 3 years to researching these various buildings. That is, that the project itself was focused on specifically churches with raised central naves. Now, various heat maps were mapped by the team, and various different elevations using various methods. Specifically, they would go through radar detection and ways of mapping from the air, at least for preliminary investigations. Their website contained mainly data of the Borgund Church, but they also had other ones and worked through several different methodologies to obtain the various results. One of which is to be shown here. It won't come through as clearly on this, but this was their way of using RTI, which is reactive transformational imaging, as a way of capturing many of the different textures of the various church woods. Now, that said, they went specifically, the main three that they spent time on were the Borgund, Hopperstad, and Kaupanger churches, as they're typologically related to many of the other types of churches within the region. Specifically with these elevated central naves for the purpose of study. They actually would go through many different iterations of what to do before settling on laser scanning to create 3D models, which are currently available online for free through their website, which I will provide below. They were going for the specific purpose of how were these built, and how were they maintained. With that said, they contained also various information as to how things were conducted. Like, for example, how a archway was actually built, and the different steps of layering that were used. Now, they contain a couple different points of interest that a viewer can go through. Each survey took upwards of around 20 days to gain all of the relevant information just to scan, and 4 months of compiling per church to ultimately render, hence why it took so long. This is because the entire church was scanned on a very close level, very close, I must say, to maximize the details and ornate carvings. Graphically speaking, it was impressively accomplished with a near-perfect fit of the entire church. The nature of the wood-on-laser scanning reflected the light to an incredible degree, even remarked by the scientists on the page. And they had over 150 different sites that they mapped out with tech on hand, each when slotted together allowing for 3D cross-sections of the church. And to that degree, they also mentioned that it took nearly 15 minutes per location just to map it out. By the end of mapping and compiling, the combined work would show 90 billion measurement points, all to be reconstructed through CAD drawings and reworked as a 3D model. These models were in turn used to reverse engineer the churches in a digital landscape to understand the process and history of how they were built. Findings from the project revealed a few commonalities between the construction of these architectural feats. Scanned for timber joints revealed some places that the wooden archways were made, displayed in their 3D renderings. Like seen here, a entrance to the church is seen over here, being a particular way of lining it up with various plot work and planks. Similarly, we see at Hopperstad, they managed to draw further order of operations on the construction between columns. It seemed they were put into fixed positions between the columns before any ornate wood carvings were put. Which, for a few examples, that is Borgund, excuse me. These are carvings from the church at Hopperstad. I think it's quite impressive. As well, they were also seen at the church in Lahm, and all of these were crafted and cut without ever actually... They weren't assembled on the ground. They were lifted into place and carved while suspended. One of the scan points that was interesting was at the church at Lahm, where markings on boards that existed prior to modern day, but much younger than a lot of other original markings, were that of a extension project that was done. This was due to the way that some of the carvings that were on these were done and assembled beforehand by the way of marks. Now, this points to the group that was later deduced to have done their carvings in, I believe, yes, it is 1646. And this extension actually showed that they made the extension and then cut the hole into it later, which seems a bit odd to do at Lahm. Similarly, bits of construction akin to the lawn markings were found in the bell tower near the central nave of the Kaupanger Church, along with many of the marks found to be pointed to the idea of prefabrication. As of the stylization of carvings before being done, once secured, is absent, and this shift kind of points to a demographical change within the culture over time. The Borgund Church scans revealed that, compared to previous belief, they didn't have the church built with its nave on its side and then raised up, but instead was built around the scaffolding, as depicted here. Starting over here, it built its way towards the left into this model that we see here, of which I have a much higher quality rendering, although I don't have a way of showing this on their website itself. At least not at the moment with my current technical skills. This is the full cross-section of the church minus its roofings, to allow you to see the insides. Now, while these findings are present, and there's a lot more of them, a better question is, what does this mean for the Norwegian people, right? Why go through this whole process? Excuse me. The outcome of the study was presented with an entire cultural context segment, beginning with Borgund, as previously shown. Now, Borgund found several unique iterations that would be later repeated in other churches, as it's one of the earlier ones. All churches had what they called arched knees after this time, which were originally found to be a type of structural reinforcement made from rootwood due to its integrity as a wood. And the Borgund stave churches scans showed a unique variation on these knees. These were actually present in the construction of the original church roofs, and they were congruent with various different Viking vessels. I believe it was... Well, this is part 2 of my recording after I was rudely interrupted by the camera fighting me. That said, the ships were built, or the church was built with over 12,000 nails, 10,000 of which were specifically used on just shinglings, while around 1,200 were used for the frame. And 40% of these total nails were a modified type of, these were a modified type of wooden nail. Specifically, they were considered wedged, which, as depicted here, reveals the way that they were hammered in from the top to widen them out. Now, wooden nails were used in places where this metal wasn't so readily available, as a way of keeping structures uniform as well as their iterations. These two-part wedges were designed to help secure the nails in deeper. You see, wood is not as nearly static a material as, like, stone or metal, and it warps on its own, as well as decays. It has water, heat, cold. All of this can affect and damage it and change its size and shape. The specialty nails were found similarly used in the Skåldelev Viking ships found in Denmark, as I mentioned earlier, fastening to the bow of the ship to the knee. The nails used as a method of combating the wood rot and warp due to the two-part wedging, helping secure it more tightly. It's estimated that it would have taken around 20 or so days just to make the nails for the shingles alone. A stark detail is just the amount of work put into one of these churches and the expenses spared. The cost was to be borne by those who wanted to pay for something nice to worship in, or in some cases likely just paid from the taxes taken from the local populace. And to mention details, the Preservation Society noted carvings on animals on pillars, near the portals of the church at Borgund. Their stylizations are found in other places of similar design, and in fact, these animals are carved into the portal pillars of the Lom and Borgund churches as nearly identical to one another, with several other portal carvings at Al, Hege, and Norre being pretty similar, all right near the second entrance to the church. While not entirely understood, it's recognized that these animals are a depiction of particular importance to these people, as the second entrance would have caused a massive issue in structural heat loss. So there had to have been a cultural or at least theological reason for why this church would have a second entrance. Sure, it could be argued it was just they don't want a fire hazard, but there's some more that points to it not being so. They didn't have very high scans of these on or high resolution on their website, but they weren't in color either, so unfortunately you aren't getting the best of the best. Now, this is also one seen there. This one is quite a bit more high definition, of a knurled horse. However, the animals that were specifically found on the pillars are interesting, as these at Lommen were facing the exit that would lead directly out to the cemetery, as it was directly adjacent on this property. One theory is that because of this, the animals were always looking at the people when entering, similar to other places, but this one in particular are the two closest examples due to the similarity of the carvings. A lot of these animals contained the teeth surrounding the head of a human, and it's theorized that perhaps these were meant to keep an eye on the people coming and going from a funeral procession. Perhaps they were watching for any dead trying to sneak their way back in and meant to protect the living. It would seem that early esotericism mixed with Christianity in a unique way to these people. Now, with that said, Hege and Norre's animals are uniquely depicted with human heads in their teeth being crushed, suggesting their more defensive violence if needed for the church guard. Some of them are depicted as lions, other great beasts, and several other animals. This one, I believe, is from Borgund, of the two-headed dog with the serpent-like tail. Another, I believe this one is from Al, depicts the eagle. And I believe this one is from Hopperstad, of the pillars that were facing the door. Now, there's other ones, like, for example, beasts with elongated tails, or lizard-like ones, or the ones at Norre. And these actually earned their own name, the Kerberos dogs. They're mythical beasts of sorts, almost chimera. One of them was depicted as having a two-headed dog with a snake for a tail, which is certainly an interesting design choice to put in a holy place. That said, these were actually from a local castle, as being the oldest point of these seen. These carvings point to a superstitious background, even something that 4 centuries of Christianity and its practices couldn't really hide. Now, excuse me. Stave churches in their own right depict Christianity and the Christianized Norway to a T. They were valued, they were treasured, and costly in their own. Research done by the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Norwegian Heritage points to the parts of their interconnected and vibrant cultures, much of what has evolved in the country we now see. Shipbuilders made churches, and in that same vein, the superstitious few became the faithful many, with old culture passing repeatedly through new hands. Research projects like this one, done by this team from Munich, are not only capable of understanding the history, but providing a rich and culturally glorifying way of history, as well as comprehension for previous world wonders, for lack of a pretentious term. Now, I have to admit, my family is actually Norwegian. I have never been there personally, but some of these places are planned to be visited soon, or being visited by my family members, as we are somewhat connecting with them culturally. So I have to admit a touch of bias on all of this. My grandmother herself is actually from the Vestland region, and she has family there, whom maybe one day I'll meet. I had some of her inspiration talking to me before this, and we have history tracing back to around the 1600s in the region. That said, I'm hoping to do them justice with this project, and I've recently found out I'm around 50% Norwegian-blooded myself, so Norway and various regions of Scandinavia, for that part, have always been particularly interesting to me because of that. And overall, I find their church methods very interesting, considering most of the early ones were Lutheran, and that translated to the town in North Dakota that my grandparents found themselves in. And this is also because Norway has kind of fallen to the wayside in terms of history. They don't really have a presence in modern history, aside from being viewed as Vikings, which is, I think, rather unfair. Or they've been sanded off the edges, as they were at the fringe of what was considered European history. Because of that, I find the interest in these stave churches enjoyable, and I hope that one day research will be done more and more into them. So, with that, I'm going to show some of my favorite churches, and I will round out this project. I'm not really sure what I'll get for a grade, because I don't think this is incredible work, but I'd like to think I've tried. This is from the town of All. This one has actually been rather modernized, though they still keep some of the original designs intact. It's very old-timey, for lack of another word. Now, this is one of the old original ones. This one is from Borgund. Has a very unique structure to it, and unfortunately I couldn't get the photos from their website as they didn't really want to cooperate. But this is the one that I showed the cross-section of earlier, I believe. This one is similarly from, this one's from Hopperstad, and they do look incredibly similar. However, I promise these ones are different ones. Turns out Norwegians aren't the most creative all the time. This one is the one from Lore, and has its own unique ways. It's not entirely modern, but you can see some of the translations for later churches that we'd see now kind of coming into play. If I'm not mistaken, this one is the church at Kalpanger. This one being where, also very old-timey looking, but I suppose it's old-timey for a reason. And finally, I have a view of the inside of the Borgund Church from the floor up. That said, that concludes both my plans for this project and my semester. I'm going to have to figure out a way to get these two spliced together. Thank you for your time, and this is me signing off.